Welcome to the Layman's Seminary. We're continuing our series on dispensationalism short answers, and this is part 3. It's a review, and it's a review for those that have already been exposed to the material, but it's an overview or a preview for those that have not. In other words, it can orient you to future studies where you can go back and watch our videos that we've already made. But basically, as you're watching this series or rewatching this series, the main thing to keep in mind, initially I called this an introduction series because we're given simple answers at the very beginning and then we're building as we go. Or another way to put it, we're doing the drill down technique where we're going at it at a basic level, then we're breaking it down, going deeper and deeper and seeking deeper refinement. So if you haven't seen these videos, then you can go to the bite-sized dispensationalism playlist, and these are short videos specific to certain questions that are being asked. And so you see in the very first review session that we go over the answers for those that are very brief. But if you want to see the process, how things unfold in the learning, then you can go there. Now, those videos themselves are breakdowns of the first few videos that I did in the full dispensationalism playlist. The reason I did that way is because I'm starting inductively asking questions, and I wanted to do all that before I interacted with any other material and things like that, just to give people a feel for things. Okay, my cat is hollering at me right now. She probably wants out. Let me let her out 1 second. Y'all read that, and I'm going to read it to you when I get back. Just take a second. Come on, Snowy. Bye. Okay. So this is the summary statements based on the answers that were given in the other summary videos. So I'll go ahead and read it. God runs the earth, his household, by distinct arrangements throughout human history. This relates to the overarching purpose of glory, with salvation being one of his glorious activities. Salvation is not primary because it did not exist prior to the fall, but fellowship, worship, and service did exist in the Trinity, the angelic realm, and in the garden before the fall occurred. God's self-disclosure includes the cross in his glory. God is the glorious one that gets the glory for all his wise, just, perfect judgments upon nations and individuals in the past, present, and the future. For now, we could say you are a dispensationalist if you view the glory of God as the overarching theme of God's plan and arrive at a clear and consistent distinction between Israel and the church through literal interpretation. If one mistakes salvation as the overarching theme, he is more likely to blur this distinction. God clearly reveals himself as glorious through communicating clearly by his covenants, which show he is faithful to his distinct promises. It is fine if a person differs on the number of dispensations, but it's important to know how some people arrive at 7 dispensations for Bible study purposes. The elements of a dispensation is also to keep in mind, especially emphasizing his graciousness. Now, there's a couple statements that I made here. I want you to understand that this is just the beginning point. This is not necessarily where we end up, but this is just reviewing the things that we talked about, because I'm building up to the larger discussion of things, to the deeper discussion of things. Okay, so in the bite size, we asked this question: what 3 things make you a dispensationalist? And the answer to that, just for right now, we're going to say that it's the overarching theme of the glory of God, literal interpretation, which we'll talk about in the future, a clear and consistent distinction between Israel and the church. Now, another thing to keep in mind, that work through in your mind, is that there's elements of a dispensation. In other words, what occurs in a dispensation. And so here they are: the event, human responsibility, human tests, human failure, divine judgment. And this is in brackets because it's emphasizing an attribute or approach of how God is gracious in the midst of all of this. This chart right here contrasts dispensational between covenant theology. It probably is an overgeneralization, but it's helpful to get a person started in this discussion. This is the very first video, the big idea of God's plan, and that's where we're asking, is it glory or is it salvation or something else? This is the sermon form, if you'd rather have a sermon version of that. This is the other video where we're breaking down the elements of a dispensation. in that we start dealing with in number 3, we hone down in, even though we asked this question at all levels of the video so far, we're going into detail with emphasis concerning the definition of dispensation, which we actually covered in the other video. This is not in the videos that I have, but I went ahead and put it here because it helped in explaining dispensation. Oikonomia, where the English word economy comes from. You can see it's translated as administration, household management. It can even refer to a task or whatever. We'll go into more detail of that. So we've talked about the Socratic method, and by that I just mean answering questions and question and answers. We've talked about the big idea of God's plan. We've talked about the sine qua non. Those are those 3 things that were mentioned earlier. We went into a word study in the previous video, and basically I moved from English to the original language at a basic level for those that do not study the languages in detail. And then we looked at the scripture use of things. That all happened in the previous video, previous review video. These are some of the scriptures that we consulted in the previous review video. So this one says only go to Israel. This says go to all nations. So there's a distinction going on there. Ephesians 1:10 uses dispensation to refer to the millennium. Luke 6 talks about the management idea of a stewardship. 1 Corinthians 4 talks about Paul being entrusted with a stewardship. So this is just talking about how the word is used in scripture. Galatians refers to the tutor imagery in that way. Ephesians 3 talks about the mystery and administration and stewardship. Colossians, the same thing. And Ephesians focuses on the mystery. You can see a discussion of those, a brief discussion of those in the previous video and the elements video, I think it is. Or maybe it's the definition. Okay, so this is what Ryrie says. The Bible does name 2 dispensations in the same way the dispensations do, and applies a third. So he's saying that the Bible is using the word dispensationalism for the millennium, for the church age, and it's implying that concerning the law being one. And we'll talk about this study of dispensation later on, and we'll get more accuracy concerning that. But for right now, let's let that ride. So here's he's describing the different terms that are involved there. It's primarily a stewardship and not a period of time, even though it occurs during a period of time. This is Ryrie's definition: a distinguishable count in the outworking of God's purpose, which he believes is glory, which we're going to talk more in detail. In Dispensationalism 4, the main video, we talk about the glory of God, and we're examining that. What does Ryrie mean by the glory of God? And if we're going to adopt the glory of God as an overarching theme, how does that relate to how the dispensationalist expresses things? When we're talking about the Socratic method, we're talking about questions like this. Will you clarify that? What are your assumptions? What supports that? What about this viewpoint? What are the implications? And what do you think about this question? That type of stuff. Okay, so Ryrie talks about that when we're talking about dispensationalism, we can look at it from theological, which focuses on God, eschatological, which focuses on end time, or doxological, when it traces the different manifestations of the glory of God throughout time. What's interesting here, and we talk about it in the video that I'm highlighting here, is that when it's talking about history, it's talking about human history, and if so, the dispensations are limited to human history. And notice he talks about the millennial glory. So if that's the case, then when he's talking about the emphasis on the glory of God, he's premillennial. And we'll get into these more words later on, but basically there's 2 views of things. There's premillennial covenantalism. That means you're a covenant theologian that believes in a millennium. And then there's dispensational premillennialism, which is a dispensationalist that believes in the millennium. So if you have those 2 views, you're still millennial, and it would be emphasizing the glory there. But when a covenant theologian that is not premillennial talks about the glory of God, he's talking about it in a more general sense. And I think there's even places where Ryrie's talking about the glory of God in a broader sense than just the millennial glory, even though he sees it as a culmination. So we're going to talk about that in more detail. So here he is. The goal of history is the earthly millennium, so it means the human history. where it be manifested in the presence of Christ. He says the unifying principle is eschatological because it has a goal. You may want to use the word teleological because of that. Theological because it's related to the self-revelation of God. Doxological because it relates to the overall manifestation of the glory of God. Notice he says overall manifestation. He's not just talking about the millennium. So he's talking about progressive revelation here and how it relates to stages and how the content is increased. What we know about God and his ways is increased throughout his revealing of himself in his word. Basically, these distinctions are distinctive. Related to progressive revelation. So he's basically saying whenever you have a philosophy of history, you got to have a proper goal, a proper unifying principle, and a proper concept of progress. And he says that dispensationalism provides that. Ryrie's just a man. He's been helpful in this area. We're going to interact, of course, with the Bible in more detail, but we're just making people aware of these discussions because as they read other things. Now he brings in the issue of consistent hermeneutics. Ryrie's position is that most people use the same hermeneutic, but the literal interpretation or historical grammatical, but it's the dispensationalist that's most consistent to it. He tries using these terms literal, plain, and normal to clarify what he means. And by plain, he means clear communication. Normal means it normally occurs among humans, in everyday speech and pattern and stuff like that. And we'll go into that a little bit more in detail. In the video, we talk about the issue of God condescending, and we use the illustration of comparing the internet, telling the ant about the internet, as opposed to, in order to warn the ants of an impending destruction, you become an ant to warn them. So, and of course, that's not denying that God ceased to be God when he became a human, but we're talking about that to show that God is a clear communicator, that God desires to communicate in personal ways as such. Okay, so here's the passage where we're talking about where Jesus is forbidding them to don't go to the Gentiles or into the Samaritans. But here we have the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's preaching that, and he's talking about how they should do things during this time because it's short. He's ministering, he's offering the kingdom during this time. In my view, the kingdom of heaven is the Messianic Davidic kingdom, not the church. Now, there are other kingdoms in scripture possibly mentioned, but that's a whole other issue that we'll get to later on. Matthew 28, it says, go to all nations. So this is probably a reference to the Gentiles, where I could recognize that it could be talking about disciples, Jews that are scattered in the nations, but I don't think that's the thrust. I think this is talking about Gentiles as well. So it's talking about consistent application of that. That's the central idea in the word dispensation is to manage and administering the affairs of a household. And so in this video, the fifth video, we go into the economy illustration. So the previous one of our videos, we did a household illustration. And so the economy illustration he's putting it as the core, the definition. And so if you think about different economic systems in this one world, you got a continuum when you got free market and you got planned economy here and different ones that exist here. They're different arrangements, okay? So there's certain things that are same or similar, but they're not exactly the same. Now this is a Venn diagram talking about different types of economies: command economy, mixed economy, and tradition economy. And so this is a Venn diagram, and this is showing you that where there's no overlap, that's the full differences. Okay, all the D's right here. Then whenever there is some overlap, that's a similarity. Okay, and in a similarity between these two in the sameness aspect. But where it overlaps in every single area with this triangle thing here, diamond, this is the sameness idea. So whenever we're coming to scripture, we need to be asking this about anything we're studying. What is similar? What is different? What is exactly the same? Okay, so he's talking about that they had to be distinguishably different there. He's talking about there are functions, features, and items that are the same. So that relates to what's later on talked about our carryovers. Okay, so there's certain things that we believe that you can mark off distinct from each other, and that's wherever you're going into scripture and you're looking at the differences. Yeah, there is continuity, but we're looking for shifts and differences. Okay, and so the dispensations are related to God's viewpoint, not man's. At least that's the claim. So God's the one that institutes the dispensations and brings them to conclusion. They're introduced by God, they're retained by God, and they're combined. So any features that God incorporates or reincorporates, he's the one in charge of all that. This is an older dispensational book by Eric Sawyer, The Dawn of World Redemption, where he's using this language. Early on, he's using the term period as if it is a dispensation, but actually a dispensation is what's going on during a period of time, but it's not the period of time itself. Rather, this idea of change relates to new revelation, new responsibility, stewardship, and so that's what's going on there. But even he talking about carryovers, not using that term, but he basically says some things continue, some things are annulled or done away with, and then there's others that are freshly introduced. Okay. So viewing God is running the household, dispensing or administering affairs through various stages. Okay. And these different economies are outworking of his total purpose, which relates to the glory of God. And they're saying it's essential to proper interpretation because you have to know which economy you're in so that you know how to interpret certain things. This is an older dispensation as well. Graham Scroggie, I think is how you pronounce his name. And he's talking about the central idea behind administration. Behind dispensation, oikonomia is the concept of administration, whether it's a house, a property, and so on. And he's talking about it as it relates to the human race. So we'll talk about angels later on, but right now they're focused on human race. Okay, and so he makes this comparison I've used many times and stuff, that a parent at different stages in the child's development parents differently, but it's all to one good end, to make them effective members of society and all of that. So in the same way, and of course, if you're a Christian, to bring them up in the admonition of the Lord. But so the idea is that while God has different ways that he's revealed himself and different ways he's arranged things throughout human history, it's all coming to this great end, what he would say was culminate in the millennial kingdom. And that's why some people don't believe the eternal state is a dispensation, because it doesn't have to do with history or time, but we'll talk about that later on. He's talking about the economy, order, condition of things. He's basically saying one house is not necessarily the same house. So you can think about all the people that live around you on your block. Every parent does not rule his house or does not govern his house or parent his house in the exact same way. And you learn this as a little kid, that you grow up learning things, how you do it in your house, but then you go stay the night at your friend's house and you find out things are done differently. And it's the same thing with a nation. Each nation has different rules. Each state has different rules. Each business has different rules, different culture, if you will. So just talking about that analogy there. So right here, a dispensation or economy then is that particular order, conditions of things prevailing in one special age. So here, this person is not saying it is an age or period. It's saying it's occurring in a special age, what does not prevail in another. Okay, this is another older dispensationalist, Clarence Mason. You can find this at ancientpaths.net. His quote right here talks about how the dispensations are revealing of God's mind and will, and therefore it's important for us to understand scripture. It relates to the concept of reward and blessing, warnings of judgment. You could probably include those inside of our elements of a dispensation when we're talking about them. Here's the term carried over being used here, but then there's the cumulative body of truth, because he's talking about how timelessly truth principles carry over. Here's another dispensational source. I think this was a dissertation And so right here, he's kind of describing things in terms of the elements, some of the elements you see in his earlier work. So from the divine standpoint, from God's standpoint, it's a stewardship because man's entrusted with it. It's a rule of life because man's responsible to live by it. And it's a responsibility for managing God's affairs in his house. From a historical standpoint, it's a stage in the progress of revelation. So a dispensation from God's viewpoint is an economy, from man's a responsibility, and in relation to progressive revelation, a stage in it. And that's it. We will continue summarizing, but in this particular video, we essentially summarize 2 videos into one. So with that said, like this if you haven't already, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell if you want notification, keep this ministry in prayer, especially do that, and share this with others. God bless.